So I'm going to talk about, this is broadly about many worlds quantum mechanics, but it's also about different kind of strategies for explanation. And you can take notes about like the relation between causal and non-causal explanations in quantum theory. So the kind of background thought is that not every explanation needs to be a causal explanation. Or at least not every explanation needs to be a causal explanation of the kind that we're like most familiar with. And I think there's a kind of phenomenon in philosophy of physics that sometimes people kind of reach for the explanatory strategies they're most familiar with and assume that explanations in their favourite physical theories are going to be causal. And that sometimes leads you into unnecessary trouble. So what I think we should instead do is include in our interpretive debates, have as a moving part which of the explanations involved are going to be regarded as causal, not kind of hold that fixed from the outset, but like have that as something that we can adjust if we need to get like a good overall interpretation. And in particular, in many worlds I've written in quantum mechanics, we have different ways of setting up the ontology of the view, and those tend to lead to quite different views about which explanations are causal and which aren't in many worlds, and that in turn has knock-on effects for notions of locality, like causal action locally or causal action at a distance. So I'm going to suggest a way of developing the metaphysics of many worlds quantum mechanics whereby it retains like a fully locally causal picture, which interpreters of quantum theory generally take to be a good feature, but it does so in a bit of a different way from maybe the orthodox way of getting quantum theory to be local. So the kind of conclusion is not that you kind of have to go this way, the way I'm going to describe, but that it is an available option that kind of sits alongside the perhaps kind of better known way of developing ever in a local fashion. So that's all pretty abstract, but hopefully it will be clearer by the end. This was also a longer talk. I think I wrote this as like a 45-minute talk, so I might not have time to cover everything. I think most people kind of have a bit of a grasp of the basic issues at stake, so I'll move reasonably fast. But if there's too many like deeply puzzled faces, I'll try and slow down. Okay, so I'm going to start with a kind of like more kind of generalised philosophical point about not overextending causal explanation beyond its proper bounds, and then narrow down into many worlds quantum theory, and talk about two kind of important decision points that you face when you're trying to interpret many worlds that have been the discussion of quite a bit of debate in the recent literature. Local branching versus global branching, and overlapping versus diverging worlds. Local branching and global branching has been really prominent in the description about locality. Overlapping and diverging worlds is more prominent in the literature on probability. But I think it also bears on the locality question in a way that I'll explain. And the option that I kind of want to exhibit and like give a kind of preliminary defence of, but not a decisive defence of, is a view that combines the diverging picture, a sort of parallel world view of many worlds, with a view of causation where it all happens inside individual worlds. So you don't have causation between the worlds. It's not like stuff in one world ever causes stuff in any other world, but nor do we have causation of the worlds. The worlds themselves don't get caused to exist. And that's, I think, revisionary. The more familiar approaches to writing quantum mechanics do have the world getting caused to exist, perhaps by like kind of previous states of the wave function, something like that. And then if we don't have causation extending outside of individual worlds, if all causation is like located within individual Everett worlds, then we need to look elsewhere for the kind of explanations we might want to give of like the whole space of worlds, or of the property of some individual world. And I'm going to suggest that we can appeal to a more metaphysical form of explanation there. I'm going to use this notion of common ground explanation, that has been defended by some people, including kind of Jonathan Schaffer and Janan Ishmael recently. But I don't think it's the only way to go. It's a kind of good candidate for an interesting form of non-causal explanation. The main point is that whatever explanations there are between worlds, or of all the worlds, those ones shouldn't be thought of as causal. That's the idea. Okay, so what kinds of explanation are there? How should we draw the distinction in different kinds of explanation? So the kind of big picture background thought is that we should explain things in a way which fits with the kind of things they are. So if we have a phenomenon which is kind of the kind of phenomenon that can enter into causal relationships, then those sorts of phenomena are suitable to be explained causally. But if we have a different kind of phenomenon, one that kind of isn't the right kind of thing to enter into causal explanations, then we shouldn't try to explain it causally. It's sort of a platitude, but I don't think this distinction is kind of drawn very often. Just because we're not explaining things causally doesn't mean that we can't explain them in some other way, but it might mean that we can't explain them in some other way. I mean, if a fact isn't suited to be causally explained, but it's also not suited to be metaphysically or mathematically explained, well, presumably it's just not suited to be explained at all, and maybe that's okay. But I do think a lot of the facts in the many worlds interpretation, which are sometimes causally explained, can be explained in these other sorts of ways instead, rather than just left kind of as brute facts as unexplained. So the basic thought is that the character of our explanations should be properly tuned to the character of the phenomena that they're explanations of. And then this is a bit of kind of amateur psychologizing. I have a sense that we we have a tendency as humans, as like investigators, as theorizers, to go for causal explanations, to kind of reach for them as a default. And you can try to give like kind of potted evolutionary explanations of this. You can say, well, we evolved in an environment where causal explanations were really important. It was kind of important for us to be able to kind of avoid the potential causes of our own death by like dodging the tigers, and it was kind of important to be able to kind of find the stuff that was going to cause our ongoing existence. I mean, like the food and water and so on. So like we are like creatures embedded in a thoroughly causal environment that we causally interact with all the time, and the things we need are things that we can stand in causal relations to. So against that sort of background, it's not surprising that we get quite good at thinking causally. You might say, if you were kind of in the mood to do this sort of cognitive evolutionary psychology, that we've kind of evolved a causal reasoning module. And you can maybe try and find some support in cognitive psychology for this, like the fact that we're quite quick at making causal judgments. We don't have to kind of theorize our way. We don't have to like kind of think up an analysis of causation and then check that all the disjuncts apply one by one. We just like can make snap causal judgments quickly and generally quite reliably, it seems. So we're pretty good at this. And you can compare it with this idea that like it was kind of useful for us to be able to detect whether there were agents around, and sometimes we kind of overextend that. There's this phrase, hyperactive agency detection, where we kind of have a tendency to kind of attribute agency to things in the natural world that we kind of reflectively know don't have agency, but we see faces in the clouds. We think that the random events have a causal explanation when really better explanation is just random. So there's a sort of tendency, I think, to overextend our causal reasoning, kind of because it comes so naturally. Whenever we've got a why question, we tend to answer it causally. So then this can sometimes lead us astray. So just to talk about these very quickly, there's a couple of kind of cases that maybe the most natural examples are sort of in philosophy of religion. So Descartes is notoriously said to have believed that God was the cause of the mathematical truths. So it was like a kind of a free voluntary act of God that caused all the mathematical truths to hold as opposed to not holding. And if you're thinking in terms of like a kind of divine creation myth, you might well think that like what substances are identical with what kinds is also potentially causally explainable. So like kind of God's creating the world, and they say, well, like let the water be made of H2O. So it's like maybe we could have made the water of something else, but we're going to have it be made of H2O. And so then these sorts of kind of like kind identity statements could be caused if that's your picture of creation. In a more kind of physics setting, the kind of overextensions that are more familiar might be if we try to explain indeterministic outcomes causally. So, you know, this is the thing, you know, it was kind of surprising when physicists concluded at the start of the 20th century that quantum mechanics really was indeterministic in a way that couldn't be avoided, that like indeterministic laws were a kind of basic part of nature. And it's kind of hard for us to get our head around, and there is a kind of ongoing tendency to seek an explanation of why, you know, even when we know that it's like there's a 50-50 chance of the particle being measured spin up, spin down, we kind of want to seek a explanation for why it went that way rather than the other way. You know, maybe there's some sense in which it's like kind of a motivation to have causal explanation of indeterministic outcomes that motivates certain hidden variable theories. Because it is, you know, something that hidden variable theories seem to give you is causal explanations of those outcomes. And likewise, initial conditions. You might like say, well, initial conditions are not the kinds of things to be explained causally, but it's kind of hard to stop wondering about what might have caused them. It's like if we become convinced that there isn't a physical explanation because there are initial conditions, maybe there's some kind of non-physical explanation in terms of kind of divine action that might, and that seems to be a kind of more satisfying explanation. But I think all of these are kind of cases of overextension of our causal reasoning. And then the claim is going to be that the kind of causal explanations I'm going to consider in many worlds are kind of in this general category of cases of our causal reasoning module kind of getting carried away. Okay, so now that was all kind of the general background motivational stuff. Now we're going to talk about everything quantum mechanics. I'm not going to go into details about what everything quantum mechanics is. It's a many worlds interpretation. It says that when there's a quantumly random event, there's a world that corresponds to each of those possible outcomes. There's a probability distribution over those worlds given by the Born rule. And kind of on this view, kind of what quantum mechanics has shown us is that actually there's more worlds than we thought they were, but they're all the same kind of thing that we already live in, and it's just like more of the same. So it's kind of the same way that kind of cosmology has expanded how like large we think the universe is spatially. Quantum physics has expanded how large we think reality is in the sense of how many distinct worlds it contains. And so one big subject of discussion in many worlds foundations has been locality. And it's been kind of, I think, particularly controversial because Everettians have made kind of grand claims about their theory, about the ability of their theory to maintain locality. So we get people like David Wallace and going back a bit further, Brown and Timpson, who have said like one of the best reasons for believing the many worlds interpretation is because it's causally local. And it is causally local in a way which doesn't conflict with relativity. So, kind of, why doesn't it conflict with relativity? Well, it doesn't need a preferred frame of reference in the way that certain other approaches, like objective collapse theories, they seem to need a preferred frame in which the collapses occur. At least simple-mindedly, and in Bohmian mechanics, at least in the kind of classic formulations, there's a preferred frame, the one in which the guidance function kind of evolves continuously, and in which the particles are kind of steered together in. So I'm just going to grant that there isn't any need for a preferred frame of that kind to account for collapse. but it might still turn out that Everettian quantum mechanics is causally non-local in some other sort of way. And there have been arguments of that kind. So a concept of distinction that I'm going to be using here is between two kinds of causation. Two kinds of ways in which causation might be non-local. It might be non-local in an event causation sense. So here we have, like, non-local event causation would be two different events at space-like separation that nonetheless are causally linked. So it's like I make a measurement over here, and that instantaneously changes, determines some other event at the space-like separation. So Alice measures her particle, and that instantaneously determines changes the state of Bob's particle at space-like separation. That sort of non-local causation we're going to call event causation. And then this other kind, which is going to be kind of the focus really, is what I'm going to call world-shaping causation. I just had to make up a word, that's the word I used. I don't think anyone's used that before, but I haven't come across any other terms for it either, so that's the choice. And here we have a sort of global kind of consequence of a localized event. In particular, in the Everettian setting, splitting of worlds is the relevant thing. Because at least on some ways of developing the Everettian interpretation, what happens when you make a measurement is that you split the worlds. There was one world before, you take a measurement, now there's two. So you've changed the number of worlds in existence. You've changed it from 1 to 2. That seems to be like a pretty big, impressive thing to do, and like, there have been people objecting, how's that even possible? So I'm not going to like push that sort of objection. The worry is not that world-shaping causation is kind of weird or scary. The worry is that it might be non-local. In particular, this objection came up in a paper by Sabins and Carroll. They're really talking about something a bit different. They're talking about solving the probability problem for many worlds. But they say actually, because this like world splitting is a non-local, it's kind of, it affects the whole world at once. It's a localized event causing this global change. It's not local after all. So that argument for it actually kind of goes out the window. And that was kind of a striking thing. And McQueen and Weidman have replied to this argument and argued that actually you can think of Everett as causally local even in this world-shaping sense. But these objections and their response are presupposing what I'm going to call a global concept, well, what is called in the literature a global conception of Everettian branching. So what's the distinction between local and global branching? This slide is not really about local but global branching either. This slide is about why you might want to have locality. And basically the idea is that like it's better to preserve locality than not. Why non-local explanation seems weird. It took like Isaac Newton quite a long time to reconcile himself to like non-local gravitational interactions, and then we kind of, in field theoretic physics, we kind of reassured ourselves that maybe we didn't need non-local causation after all. But so the general attitude is kind of like, if you can get causal locality, it's nice. What's global branching? Global branching is the idea that branching happens everywhere all at once. So I make a measurement, I split the entire universe. So we go from there being one universe before my measurement to two universes after the measurement. And because the universe includes everything, including like distant galaxies, we go from having like one Andromeda galaxy to two Andromeda galaxies after my measurement. So it looks like, if you're imagining the world branching in this global way, that it's just incompatible with locality. McQueen and Weidman have a move that is a kind of funky metaphysical move to try to avoid this. They say we do have the world being split globally in this way, What that doesn't do is change distant things intrinsically. So it's not that we go from there being one Andromeda galaxy to two Andromeda galaxies. There's still one Andromeda galaxy. It's just located in two places. It's in both of these worlds. So the number of worlds increases, but the number of objects at space-like separation doesn't increase, at least not immediately. And all that's changed is that the distant observer, Bob, or the distant galaxy, Andromeda, now has two locations where before it had one. So it appeals to this kind of metaphysical concept of multi-location. And they say that multi-location isn't an intrinsic change, it's an extrinsic change. So they want to say we can still maintain causal locality with respect to intrinsic changes, just not to extrinsic changes. Kind of weird view. I'm not going to criticise it in detail. There's a debate about it. So Alyssa Ney considered this objection to the McQueen-Weidman strategy that, even if there isn't an intrinsic change to the distant object, there's still a physically significant change. And Ney then rejects. She kind of considers and rejects that objection to the McQueen-Weidman's view. I actually agree. I think the objection is a good one. It just does seem that there's a physically significant difference between being located in two quantum worlds as opposed to being located in one. It may not be intrinsic, but that just then goes to show that we shouldn't be only worried about intrinsic changes. We should be worried about physically significant changes, and acquiring a second location is a physically significant change. So, even if you so just think about the actual world. If you became multi-located in the actual world, that would still be a striking and important change for you, even if in some sense it wasn't an intrinsic change. So, in the relevant sense, McQueen and Weidman don't really avoid non-local world-shaping causation. But that's not really my main focus. My main focus is this distinction between local and global branching. And this is kind of the main strategy that people have used to try to respond to this objection. They say, the problem here is with global branching. So if we avoid global branching, then we have a strategy for keeping Everettian quantum mechanics causally local. So on this sort of view, the world doesn't split all at once when we make a measurement. Rather, the splitting is a sort of local spreading out process. So you when you make a measurement, you split the world where you are, and then that kind of multiplicity of worlds spreads out at the speed of light. So you have an expanding forward light cone of multiplicity where there's two worlds in causally downstream of your measurement. But outside of that forward light cone, there's still only one world. So the world splitting happens on the edge of the expanding light cone. This is a vivid way of developing Everettian quantum mechanics. It's been pretty popular. David Wallace is perhaps the most prominent recent Everettian vigorous defensive view. And it comes out of this stuff by Chris Timpson and Brown and Timpson before that. Going back about 20 years. So I think this is an option. And the reason I don't like it is because I think it creates extra problems for probability. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think that basically the idea that the number of worlds changes in this way that is varying across the actual world messes up the best solutions to the problem of understanding probability of many worlds. And maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. But in the context of solving the probability problem, I've defended a different approach to many worlds, and I think we can use that here. So there's two pictures of many worlds quantum theory. There's the splitting worlds view and the diverging worlds view. So overlap and divergence. And so this is a metaphor that splitting worlds and parallel worlds. And it's to do with whether or not worlds have parts in common at earlier times. The same way that like roots from the base of a tree to its leaf, they have parts in common at the trunk, and then like parts that aren't in common, kind of like high up in the branches. And so I like the parallel world view. I've defended elsewhere, kind of extensively, its usefulness to help solve the probability problem. And Isaac Wilhelm has also recently defended the sort of parallel world view for probability problem kind of reasons as well. Saunders once endorsed this sort of view. I think he's rowed back and that doesn't like it anymore. Now I'm no longer around to persuade him of it. So various reasons for liking divergence. It solved various problems related to talk about the future and for probabilities, especially about the future. Gets rid of a kind of doomsday style problem that you get from like world splitting futurewards but not pastwards. And then the proposal of this talk is really that it has this further benefit of helping to recover locality in many worlds by basically getting rid of world-shaping causation altogether. So the problem with world-shaping causation, recall, was that measurement splits the world. It seems to split the world globally, or if it splits the world locally, that then leads to this sort of like discrepancy across space-time of how many worlds there are, which is super weird. But if we want to like have like in our like imaginary scenario to observe that space-like separation, Alice and Bob making independent measurements, to make sense of that, it's really nice to keep a one-to-one correspondence between Alice and Bob. We don't like suddenly go from having one Alice and two Bobs or whatever. Those things mess up the story. But in divergence, we just don't have that as a problem. In each world, there's one Alice and one Bob, and that remains constant across measurements. So that makes the probability problem a lot easier to handle. And if we don't have quantum system splitting, we don't have world splitting, then we don't need a mechanism for splitting. So there's not even any question that arises about whether it's local or global. In this sort of picture, we just have event causation. There's just no world-shaping causation at all. The worlds don't get changed by any measurements we make. And nor do we have any causation between events in different worlds. That is what decoherence prevents. I haven't talked about decoherence, but ask me about it later if you want. And so, in this picture of diverging kind of parallel world Everettianism, we just don't have any of the problematic kind of world-shaping causation that threatens to be non-local. So we've got rid of the non-locality by getting rid of the causal explanations which threaten to be non-local. And the result is that causation is just event causation only. And furthermore, it's event causation within individual Everett worlds. So all the causation in physical reality is in world. In our world, we have events causing other worlds. Events causing other events. In other worlds, we have events causing other events. Always within the world. And then once we have causation being restricted in that way, we can try to give various accounts of it, linking it to chance or linking it to counterfactuals. But our project is simpler because each world looks kind of like the actual world we're used to. And we're used to modelling causality in the actual world, including in a relativistically invariant way. And when we don't have the threat of non-locality from quantum theory, it looks like it's going to be kind of easy to give accounts of local causality within the world. We just kind of like switched off all the threats to causal locality by moving to this parallel world picture. There's a further threat, I'm not going to have time to talk about this, of whether or not this kind of picture is then going to end up violating causal principles, whether we're going to have correlations within the actual world which look like they should have causal explanations, but which turn out to just not be attributed causal explanations. There's a causal Markov condition and faithfulness, and together those things seem to rule out the the kind of picture I'm describing. But I want to suggest that we can have a different kind of explanation of these kind of correlations at space-like separation that doesn't make them causal. So, yeah, I think I'm out of time, right?
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. So I'm not going to talk about this in detail. Feel free to ask me about it. But the basic idea is that we have a sort of common ground explanation. So the correlations that we observe in our world at space-like separation in like entangled measurements on entangled systems, they don't have a causal explanation, but they do still have an explanation. It's a sort of common ground explanation in the sense of Ismail and Schaffer. So those correlations are grounded in the wave function, which is not inside any world at all. It's kind of it's the common ground of all the worlds. So we still have a sort of explanation, and I have there's a metaphor in terms of jigsaw pieces, whereby you don't want to say that like a jigsaw piece causes the shape of the jigsaw piece next to it, but nor is it coincidence they fit together. They fit together because there's a sort of common cause of their shapes, which is like the thing that printed the jigsaw puzzle. Except this isn't a common cause mechanism, it's a common ground mechanism. So it's like one step weirder than the jigsaw case, but in the same general character. So we can talk about that, but here's the conclusions. This parallel world diverging many worlds approach gives us like an independent route, which is an independently well motivated route to getting rid of the problematic world shaping causation. So we recover causal locality in a principled way. It's like we already would have liked divergence to solve probability problems. Now it also helps with locality. We can still explain like the entanglement kind of correlations at space-like separation, but they're not causal explanations. They're these common ground explanations. So we kind of sort of partly vindicate the argument for locality. We don't make these causal explanations but still causally local. We make them local but not causal. And I think that's still like something the Everett team can be happy with. So thank you. Sorry for running out of time. You want to use that? Yeah.
Slides. Okay, now we have comments from Chanwoo Lee.
Oh, it's all right. First, I have to thank Al for giving me the opportunity to read his paper. So I'm not a philosopher of quantum mechanics, so it was just a whole learning experience for me reading this paper. So my questions are largely going to be clarificatory as well. So here's the rundown from my understanding of his talk and the paper. So it concerns the problem of causal overreach and some of the examples, more mundane examples, like the divine designer causing arithmetical truths. And also it was not discussed in the talk, but under Lewis's system, causation makes sense only within worlds because of various reasons. But then what causes the plurality of worlds in Lewis's system? And that doesn't make any sense. So that would also be suffering from the problem of causal overreach. And so here in this talk specifically, so we're considering the problem with regard to the suspected known locality, non-local causality in Everettian quantum mechanics. So he considers several options in the literature, global branching or local branching, and all of them suffer from either the problem of causal overreach or some related problem that is caused by trying to avoid that. And the solution given is the divergence picture, which is separate from the overlap picture or the splitting picture altogether, which is like all these worlds are going together and they just diverge. And so here's my quote. Here's a quote from the paper. So why is this so good? So here's the counterfactual dependence, objective probabilities, and dispositional notions such as manipulability are all in world matters from the divergence perspective, and they all go together. and aberrant worlds as part of the reductive basis or physical contingency are not themselves subject to physical contingency. So that's why, well, in divergence picture, we can kind of avoid global causality, novel causality, which is taken to be a virtue. And the alternative given is transworld grounding, which is, to quote, the universal quantum state grounds or instantiates a pattern of the coherent worlds. Okay, so here's my first question. So I understand that by switching to the divergence picture, now we no longer have a question of, okay, how come the world is split in such a way? But I was wondering, maybe if I am living in one of the diverged world, and I might ask myself some parallel question. Okay, why did I happen to be in the world such that it turned out to be in such and such trajectory? Is there any explanation for that? I think this may be, again, our persistent inclination. Hey, what gives? Like, why this happened? So I just wonder if this also carries the same kind of explanatory demand as in other cases, or if it's just more of a subjective psychological one. So that was one of my questions. And if it is substantial, I wonder, okay, so then how does the trans-world grounding or the common grounding approach offered by Al address this kind of explanatory question? And I thought, okay, so the jigsaw puzzle was a good one. So I guess if you are a jigsaw puzzle, maybe your life doesn't make sense. Why is my life so absurd? But maybe if you're a God, seeing everybody in eternity, then it's all providence. It was meant to be that way. So maybe if you're under the pretense that you're a God, then it will make sense. But so this was kind of my guess, but I wonder if it's the case that the trans-world grounding is supposed to give an explanation by, in a sense, metaphorically taking a God's idea. And third, in that case, okay, so now we're taking a more global or cosmic picture. Then I wonder whether the very notion of causation can be somewhat extended. So why is the global branching so weird? Because mundane act of just observation, splitting the whole world, and that's not very manipulable, but I was thinking that maybe, especially if you're taking God's idea, and maybe causation can be extended in a way that still maintains a constitutive connection between causation, counterfactual, probability, manipulability. For example, so I thought an analogy can be made with the counterpossible literature, where counterpossible, like impossibility, can still be modeled in a way that resembles the typical framework for causation. So could that be also applied to what's going on here in trans-world grounding stuff as well? So in fact, during my literature review, I came across Al's on paper where it said grounding is possibly a causation, which was I just wonder if that can self-applicability may work in this sense. In any case, yeah, it was a huge learning experience for me, and yeah, thank you.
Quickly, thanks, Chanwoo. That's great. I think you're putting your finger on some really challenging features of the proposal. Especially that third one, I think, is something that bothers me a lot. So just taking them quickly one by one to leave time for discussion. The first one, I think it's true that there's a sort of kind of explanatory demand which is generated by the diverging picture. You've got two parallel worlds now, and it just is a fact about them that one of them goes this way and one of them goes that way. Why does this one go this way? Why does that one go that way? No answer. And maybe there's like a kind of, that explanatory demand isn't raised if you just have one world that then splits into two. There weren't two to begin with to ask why is it this one, not that one. So I think it is true that that sort of that pressure is created by the divergence picture. I've just kind of reconciled myself to the idea that we have some pressure to think that there's such an explanation, but in fact there isn't. And I do want to assimilate it to these other cases, like the pressure to think that the initial conditions should be explained, even when we know they're the kind of thing that can't be, or that indeterministic outcomes is a kind of perhaps a closer comparison. So I just kind of bite that bullet. I say yes, there's a felt explanatory demand that is, should be resisted. The second point on like kind of a God's eye view, yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to we don't need to be God to take that view. I mean, we can just be kind of very, very ambitious physicists and metaphysicians. But yeah, it involves taking a perspective which is not the kind of perspective that we could kind of actually ever occupy. But maybe that's okay because we already can want to take a perspective on the entire physical universe, even if just one of the worlds, which we could never actually see it all at once. So kind of, again, maybe it's just kind of more of the same. And the third thing, yeah, I think this is a serious pressure because I've said that we shouldn't feel pressure to think of world-shaping explanations as causation because they don't stand in the right place to counterfactuals. But kind of why not? Like, am I just like assuming that counterfactuals are themselves an in-world matter? And kind of yes, I am. Like, I've got an account of counterfactuals where it's like they hold true at the individual worlds. They may be grounded in patterns over all the worlds, but any counterfactuals about the whole space of worlds are kind of just have to be treated differently. I want to say that already we need to have a sort of two kinds of counterfactuals. There's the so-called, like Lewis has a distinction between the counterfactuals that are the right kind to support causation and the kind that aren't. He talks about it in terms of like backtracking. But like, in general, like mathematical counterfactuals, if there are any well-defined ones, are not the right sort of thing to support causation. So maybe what this involves is kind of like, we've already got two kind of baskets for counterfactuals, the causal kind and the non-causal kind. And what I'm doing is moving some of the ones that we might have thought were in the causal bracket into the non-causal bracket. And is there any independent motivation for doing that? Not really, except it makes the overall picture work out nicely. But maybe we don't need any particular independent motivation for that. Maybe that's okay. But like, I think there is at least some prima facie pressure to think that like counterfactuals of the form, like if the universal state had been different, then we would have had a different branching structure of worlds. Why shouldn't those be construed as supporting causal dependencies? It's just like part of the view that they're not. And I don't have an independent justification for that, but I just hope I don't need one. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, that was super interesting. I don't know how much of this I've understood, but I was wondering if there might have been two occasions where you helped yourself to something defending your view that maybe some of the competing views could also help themselves to. So one of them is just like this world-checking thing is not really causation, whatever extending the concept by applying that. I took it that you were saying that in defense of the view that divergence isn't caused. I was wondering why the splitter type person could also say the same thing. That's not causation. You're overextending the concept, and so there's no threat of non-local causality if you need the splitter as opposed to the diverger on essentially the same grounds which you defended your own view from that charge. The second thing of a similar nature was you helped yourself to this explanation of the EPR correlations in terms of common ground, and I said this in almost total ignorance of the details of these interpretations, but I was wondering why the Bohmian couldn't help themselves to a similar explanation. Is there something about the details of the view that just make a common ground explanation of the correlations totally implausible in the case of Bohmian mechanics, or might they help themselves with that as well?
Yeah, great questions. So, with respect to the first one, as a matter of fact, like when presenting the splitting views, like their proponents do often use causal language. They say, the measurement causes the world to split. It's a fairly like standard way of presenting that. Perhaps that's just a mistake, and they could and should systematically strip out all the causal talk. Maybe that would be a way to go that would like enable them to adopt the same solution here. I do think that maybe the splitting view tends to support the causal reading more than the divergence view. There is a fact that has changed the number of worlds. like there is one at the earlier time and two at the later time. Whenever anything else in physical reality, like, kind of changes in numerosity, that's the sort of thing that gets caused.
It's not like a trajectory change on your view of the divergence.
Well,
Once parallel now, they're no longer.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to articulate the difference, but I guess I do think that there is a difference there, that it's not like a coincidence that the splitting people have used causal language in a way that like the divergence people don't feel the same pressure to use that causal language. Yeah, I think I need to think harder about like how to articulate that difference. So thanks for that. On the second point, to do with like common ground explanations, yeah, basically yes, it can be extended. So this I mentioned Schaffer and Ismail, and Ismail has this paper with the phrase Bohm's fish tank in the title, where she basically is endorsing something like a common ground view of these correlations in the Bohmian picture. So Bohmians can and do try to take account of that as well. So it's not like this is the only view that has a common ground kind of strategy. It just works here. Maybe it works elsewhere too. That's kind of not my business. Like, it's, I'm not, there's a separate set of arguments about whether the best version of Bohm or the best version of Everett is preferable. But like, I don't, for the moment, I'm just trying to like work out what the best version of Everett is. So, but yeah, in short, you can apply it more broadly, and maybe you should. There's a follow-up from Christiane. I don't know if
sure.
that's okay.
I'm not jumping the line. It was exactly my question, so you can explain it.
Okay.
On the queue.
Great.
Thanks for the reply. I had a similar concern. It was my concern about Bohm. But then there's something I couldn't understand about the common ground. Maybe you can help me. So is the idea that there's a difference, is the idea based on the fact that there's a difference, maybe the answer is no, between parameter and outcome? Because it looks to me as if the common ground explanation is more acceptable if what grounds the two results is grounding just the outcome. You see what I mean? Not the choice of the parameter. This would be a weird grounding relation if the grounding relation is between what happens here and the choice of the parameter there. Well, if it's outcome, then it's more acceptable. This is why I like it for the, in the deterministic case, I like it for Bohm and Everett.
Nice. Okay, I see the point. So this is like the kind of like the distinction that people make in the non-locality literature between outcome independence and parameter independence.
Yeah, provided it makes sense. It makes sense at least in this common ground case. You see?
Yeah. That's just something I haven't yet thought about, so I've got no answer on the top of my head about that at all. Is at the very least outcome independence that is meant to be kind of explained in this way. And I guess I would want to say that actually I would want, ultimately I'd want to treat the parameter choice, that's also just a quantum event. It's like a different quantum event. It's like the quantum event that is going on in the minds of the observers when they do the choice of parameter to set. So insofar as there is any threat to locality from it, we can just treat it in the same way. But yeah, let's talk about this after, because I don't. It's just not something I haven't got that far into that kind of more traditional kind of locality debate in my thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Charles. So you said that the decoherence condition prevents causal relations between worlds, but this is only true once the condition is met. So I'm curious about the time before that. So is it possible to have causal relations between non-overlapping worlds before the condition is met?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what to say about kind of quantum reality in the absence of decoherence. I'm inclined to say that if we don't have the decoherence conditions met, we kind of don't have, we don't have worlds at all, we don't have macroscopic reality at all. And insofar as causation is something that happens inside those worlds, we don't have causality either. So the idea would be that kind of like all of the like relations between, say, like, if you think of it in terms of, there's many ways of thinking about this, but if you think about it in terms of like a wave function that like evolves over time according to the Schrödinger equation, we can't think of that as a causal process. So we don't think of like, the quantum state of the universe at one time, quantum state of the whole of reality at one time, determining the quantum state at causing the quantum state at a later time. Maybe if we think that's an explanation at all, we'd have to think of it on this sort of grounding model. And that is kind of counterintuitive, and I think it's because people are inclined to think of like Schrödinger evolution as causal, because like there's precedent for all like physical like differential equations to be understood causally. Like, why shouldn't we understand that causally? It just, it has bad results to understand it causally, so we shouldn't. And we shouldn't feel obliged to a priori either. Maybe there's some reason why we ought to that I haven't grasped, and I think this is coming back to what Chanwoo was saying in terms of like, it looks like we can say like if the wave function at one time was different, then the wave function at the next time would be different too. Why aren't those the kind of counterfactuals that can support causal dependencies? I think the answer just is that like you get bad consequences if they are, and you want a good overall theory, so let's just like say that they're not, and nobody is forcing us. Maybe it's just kind of like kind of prima facie it's natural to read them as causal, but we should resist that because like prima facie inclinations don't have a lot of force here. I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of the way I go.
Okay, thank you so much for this. This is really interesting. My question is about kind of how you understand worlds kind of in relation to literature. So, like, I was wondering whether you kind of endorse a kind of Wallace view on like are the worlds to be kind of what kind of like some like real patterns in the universal quantum state, and if so, kind of how does the claim that the worlds which don't overlap and that are own you, how does the claim that they are at common ground in the universal quantum state relate to if you did have the view that they are real patterns in the universal quantum state?
Yeah.
How's the grounding and maybe the other view relate to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I don't hate real patterns. I kind of tend to think that what they are is a sort of like kind of philosophy of science kind of reinventing the wheel of functional realization that is like understood more generally by like, kind of philosophers of mind, like kind of develop these concepts like functional realization in the second half of the 20th century, and Dennett gives it a kind of shiny new name and like a compelling kind of example in terms of the game of life, and then people kind of think he's doing a new thing, and so Wallace is kind of really he's just kind of doing old-fashioned functional realization, and I don't think it has to be different from the grounding story at all. I mean, I just want to say, like, if you think of it in terms of fact grounding, we have some like underlying set of facts, and they ground the fact that a certain function is performed, or a certain function is what do functions do? A certain kind of function is performed at the higher level. So I'm using the term grounding because I think it's kind of that's what like contemporary metaphysicians often use for that. I do think, I mean, there is a further question about whether or not it's like how kind of ontologically inflationary or deflationary it is. So I'm inclined to think that we should think of these worlds as like distinct pieces of ontology, not just like a redescription of the fundamental quantum state, but as something distinct from the fundamental quantum state that's nevertheless grounded in it. But actually, I think we should probably say that about real patterns too. And so, although like somebody like Wallace will like try to give a strongly non-metaphysical reading of the real patterns locution, he's kind of trying to wriggle out. You can't really do that. Like the pattern is distinct from what it is a pattern in. If we have those two distinct things that are nevertheless like connected by a necessary connection, like how different really is that from grounding at all? Like he hates the, he hates the idea that he's kind of getting close to grounding metaphysics, so he wouldn't want to kind of use that phrase. And he kind of accidentally used it in a recent paper, this like mass first structural realism, and then he had like grounds in the in an early version, and then people said, "Oh, do you mean like metaphysical grounds?" And he was like, "Oh no, I don't mean that." And he removed the phrase, but like everything else in the paper stayed the same. So he just doesn't want to be associated with those things. But I think really it's kind of there's not much philosophical kind of clear water between them.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful.
Yeah, you didn't have much time at the end to say much about the common ground explanation, and I wanted to invite you to tell me why I should think that common ground explanations are less worrying than common cause explanations. So Bell seems to show that any common cause explanation for the correlations is going to have to be super deterministic, conspiratorial, otherwise weird. So why won't the same be the case for common ground explanation?
Yeah, good challenge. I guess I mean, maybe on reflection I would not say this, but like I'm going to say it. That I think probably like whatever feature Bell attributed to those sorts of common cause explanations probably does carry over to the common ground explanations in question. And I just want to say that like kind of those features would have been problematic for common causes, but not for common grounds, because of the difference between what grounds and causes are like. And like it's I mean, another way of getting at this might be that like I think ultimately what we've got in Everett, we should think of it in a sort of kind of monistic kind of way, where there's just one structure, the universal wave function, we get kind of the appearance of pluralism at the kind of in-world level. It's the appearance as of a load of distinct things interacting causally. And so like if we were getting kind of causal relationships of the conspiratorial kind in a world, that is the kind of thing we should be worried about. But that's because like at the world level kind of, we do kind of have effective pluralism, but we don't have effective pluralism at the universal state level. There's just one thing evolving with its own kind of complex structure. And so that kind of, I don't know whether to say it's not even conspiratorial, or whether like I want to say it's conspiratorial but in a way that is not problematic. But I do want to say that like relocating the explanation in this way from a kind of explanations within one world to explanations from something metaphysically prior to all the worlds helped with that conspiratoriality somehow. But I should think more about that because I think that's a good way to press the word.
It's still it's a sort of weird kind of grounding. It's like Bob's. Normally you might think, well, Bob's measurement result is grounded in the physical state of this world, and you can say, no, it's grounded in something in this global thing. Right?
Yeah, so that is revisionary and surprising. Yeah. But I mean, I just want to go back to I lean hard on this jigsaw puzzle analogy. I want to say kind of like, is there I kind of like scrabble around in the box and I find like a piece over in this corner of the box and a piece in this corner of the box, and yet they fit together perfectly. Isn't that a surprise? And like, if there was no independent, if there was no like link between those pieces, that would be genuinely surprising. But we do think that there's in the jigsaw puzzle case, we do think that there was a common cause, and I'm just kind of reading that as a common ground. So, I think at the very least I need to find a way of articulating that difference more clearly. But I do have the sort of the gut feeling that the problematic of that problematic nature of those correlations is diluted by going global in locating them in explanation across the whole space of worlds. Yeah, not a very satisfactory way of putting it, but...
Okay, last question, Daniel.
Okay, so very briefly, it's a point about the multi-location view. I was not familiar with it, so feel free to stop me if I'm starting from incorrect assumptions. So if I got that right, the idea is that a single thing might be multi-located in different, say, branches, right? So that would correspond to sort of different spacetimes, one might think, right? I'm not sure that this would count as a sort of proper case of multi-location. Because, I mean, multi-location, a serious notion of multi-location would be one in which a single thing has more than one exact location in the same dimension. Because it doesn't count as a multi-located entity, one which has a spatial location, temporal location, maybe a location in quality space.
I get you. Yeah. So I mean,
this might have an impact on some of your considerations, because you were saying something like there was one inference from intra-world multi-location to transworld multi-location.
Yeah, I was making that comparison.
Something begins to have multiple locations. This amounts to a change in a sense, in a specific sense, and therefore also in the case of transworld, right?
Yeah, I get you. So I think it's definitely that you could definitely resist this like comparison. So I say this like an analogy. Acquiring a second location within this space-time would be a startling change. And maybe you could just say that's a bad analogy, and the startlingness is like tied to it being the one space-time. A second thing to say is that maybe if we like follow Fabrice yesterday and like generalize our locational thinking, it may not be multi-location of the kind that most metaphysicians have talked about, but it's still kind of at a slightly more general level part of the very same like metaphysical natural kind. But a third thing to say as well, I think, is that whether or not we think of these as distinct space-times is actually another moving part, because there are views that want to say we've actually got one branching space-time. So actually they are in the same space-time, they're just on like different branches of the branching space-time. So even if you count it by within a single space-time, they're still in a single space-time. That is, that's linked to a whole load of complicated questions, because it depends on whether you think of space-time as like kind of background for the possible world, or itself an entity within the world, which in turn links to quantum gravity and GR and background independent, all these sorts of like interesting fun bits of philosophy of physics that we definitely don't have time to talk about now. So thank you.
Yes, let's thank our speaker, Tom.